Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Restoring the Lungs of the Sea, Why Mangroves Matter, hosted by the Perry Institute for Marine Science. My name is Danielle Cartwright. I am the Education Coordinator here at PIMS, and I will also be serving as your MC this afternoon. Just to start, we have a few housekeeping rules for our webinar today. Firstly, we request that you mute your microphones for the duration of this webinar. Also, we will be holding a Q&A session after the presentation. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat as we will be addressing them later. Also, please note this webinar is being recorded. So with that being said, I will now introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Craig Dalhgren is our Executive Director here at the Perry Institute for Marine Science, an internationally renowned tropical marine expert with more than 30 years of experience working in the Bahamas and the Caribbean. Craig has a deep understanding of tropics ranging from mangroves to coral reef ecosystems to the efficacy of marine protected areas and the population dynamics of traditional and emerging fishery species. His research has been published extensively in peer-reviewed journals and has had an immense influence on the marine resource management and policy in the Bahamas, the Mesoamerican reef system, and beyond. Dr. Dalhgren's current work focuses on commercial fishery species like the Nassau grouper, queen conch, and spiny lobster, as well as emerging fisheries like sea cucumbers, parrotfish, sponges, and gorgonians. His pioneering research also spans the fields of coral disease and treatment, and mangrove restoration, which we are going to learn more about today. So without further ado, I now invite Dr. Dalhgren to begin his presentation.
All right, thank you, Danielle, and welcome everybody. At the Perry Institute, we're reestablishing, I guess, a webinar series now. So we will be trying to hold webinars at a fairly regular basis. So please stay tuned for that. And at the end, we can provide contact information for how to get in touch to learn more. But today I'll be talking about mangroves, why mangroves matter to us and what's affecting mangroves and what we can do about it, basically. Before I get into that, though, just a couple more words about the Perry Institute for Marine Science and about my work with mangroves. So the Perry Institute for Marine Science has been around for over 50 years, based both in the US and the Bahamas, but doing work throughout the Caribbean region. Really along two lines. The first is scientific discovery. So looking to improve our understanding of marine ecosystems, really with a focus on how that understanding will help us manage them better, restore them better, conserve them better, treat them better. We also are taking a very holistic look at conservation that involves that research, but also involves on the ground conservation, restoration, education, taking an approach of looking from the shore all the way out into the water to the reefs and the species that live there. In addition to that, we really recognize that local communities play an important role in this. So we're looking to improve education and understanding of marine ecosystems within local communities and really getting their input into everything that we do so that we can make sure that those community needs are addressed. And then further to that, getting people involved in conservation, both in terms of volunteering and in terms of developing careers in conservation for the communities in which we work. As for myself, like Danielle mentioned, I've been doing work in the Bahamas and throughout the Caribbean for over 30 years now. A lot of that work has been on coral reefs and with reef fisheries, like Danielle mentioned. But really the foundation of my work, particularly in the Bahamas, has been in mangroves. My first job really before going to graduate school to pursue my advanced degrees was looking at the importance of mangroves around Bimini for sharks as a shark nursery area. My PhD work was on the importance of mangrove creek systems for Nassau grouper and other important fishery species like spiny lobster. And over the course of my career, have been doing mangrove health assessments for the purpose of establishing marine protected areas and developing management related to mangroves throughout the Bahamas and throughout the region, really, from Abaco all the way down to Grenada in the Southern Caribbean, and from Belize all the way to the British Virgin Islands. And recently, a lot of this has been culminating in increased work on mangrove restoration and looking at ways where we can help mangroves recover from different impacts that they faced. And I'll get into that in the talk today. But what I'm going to cover is really going to start with the basics and build on that. So very generally, what are mangroves? Why are they important? What threats do they face? And then talk more specifically about the status of mangroves in the Bahamas, where they have been impacted, what's being done to protect or restore them, and then end with a little bit about what we can all do together to help mangroves. So we'll start with just the cast of characters here. The mangroves that we have in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, we really are limited to three main species. Red mangroves, the ones that have the roots that extend out into the water at the water's edge that provide habitat for fish that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Black mangroves, the ones that have these little pencil-like projections that come up out of their roots through the sand, called pneumatophores, that help the root systems aerate so that they're not drowned when the tide comes in. And then white mangroves as well. These three species are typically arranged where red mangroves are at the water's edge, from about the low tide line to about the high tide line. Black mangroves and white mangroves are a little farther elevated, so that they're exposed at low tide, but inundated at high tide. And then there's also the buttonwood, silver buttonwood, which is not technically a mangrove. It lives above the high tide line, but it does get flooded periodically, or in particularly high tides can get inundated. So it's frequently referred to as a mangrove associate. Having said all that, this zonation really holds up well when you have coastlines that have some elevation to them. In low-lying areas like the Bahamas, where the change in elevation is less than the change in the tide range, we see all three of these get mixed together. But in general, the red mangroves are the ones that are out at the water's edge, that form the edge of that mangrove shoreline, and the black and white are a little bit inland from them. Because of this, the red mangroves really have a special role, an exaggerated role and importance in terms of what they do compared to some of the other mangrove species. So a lot of what we'll be talking about is really particular to red mangroves, but are contributed to by the black and white mangroves and even the buttonwood. And part of that is the ecosystem services that they provide. This is a graphic from a recent paper, but I thought it was pretty comprehensive in terms of what mangroves do, both for nature and for people. And just to go through them quickly, I'll go into detail on some of these, but climate and pollution control is a big function of these systems. They protect coastlines. They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and take it into their biomass and bury it into the ground, making them what's referred to as a carbon sink. They support many fisheries. They are home to many different species of plant and animals, making them important for biodiversity. There's an increase in ecotourism centered around mangroves, so they are providing value to people from that function. In some parts of the Caribbean, not necessarily the Bahamas, they're important for timber or charcoal or other uses like that. And I'll talk about why maybe the Bahamas doesn't have that use as much later on. And then also they filter water as well. And we'll talk about some of these in greater depth and how these ecosystem services benefit nature, benefit people, and how they're threatened by various impacts. So we'll start looking at mangrove biodiversity. I said mangroves have a high biodiversity value, which is true. Mangroves themselves, though, don't have the same level of diversity, number of species that live there that, say, a coral reef does, or if we want to compare it to land, then a coppice forest. But mangroves have an important mix of species, marine and terrestrial and avian species that live there, increasing their diversity. And mangroves also are very important because they support the diversity in those other ecosystems. So, for example, mangroves are the nursery area for over a dozen different common coral reef species of fish. There's also a number of invertebrates that live there. So even though mangroves don't have more than maybe 20 or 30 fish species that are found there, without the mangroves, coral reefs wouldn't have those species either. So mangroves are definitely influencing the diversity on other ecosystems. That's one of the main important services they provide for biodiversity. And there are also a number of plants and animal species that are only found in mangroves as well, throughout their lives as juveniles and adults. Along the same lines, mangroves are important for fisheries, particularly as a nursery area again. There are commercial fish species, some of the snappers, some of the groupers, spiny lobster, even queen conch live in mangrove creek systems or mangrove sound systems and live in and among the mangrove roots. Recreational fish species, bonefish, tarpon, live in mangroves. Also, mangroves are very important fisheries for subsistence fishing for local communities, like the picture of this fisherman here, where fishermen with a small boat that are limited in where they can go, mangroves are very close to these communities. They're easy to get to. They're not weather dependent the way it is going out to the reef to fish. Mangroves are always there, and there are a number of fish species, particularly some of the snappers like gray snapper, that live there throughout their lives and support subsistence fishing. So they're very important for food security in places like the Family Islands in particular. Moving on from how mangroves affect other species, they affect the physical environment as well. And one of the things is water filtration. The root systems of the mangroves hold sediment. They act as a baffle for water flow, which causes sediment particles, nutrients in the water to settle out. They absorb those nutrients, incorporate them into their biomass, and filter water that way. So runoff from land really gets into the mangroves, and a lot of it's filtered out there, so it doesn't make it out to the coral reef, where it would smother and kill the corals or prevent the corals from growing in the first place. Similarly, in the mangrove root system, there are things like these mussels that are in the picture, tunicates, sponges that all filter feed and take phytoplankton out of the water, filter the water, make it clear so that it, again, favors coral growth by the time it makes it out to the reef. So mangroves are an important buffer, preventing that runoff from land or from in places where there's river systems from reaching coral reefs and allow corals to grow. And the reverse is true too. It's not just the marine environment that's being protected from the effect of land, it's the land that's being protected from the marine environment by mangroves as well. Mangroves serve as a buffer for waves and storm and flooding events. So in places where there are mangroves, we see less damage from flooding, from hurricanes, from high waves and tsunamis. These are all services that mangroves provide to protect the shoreline. And they not only protect it, they also help build the shoreline out. All those mangroves, as they're growing, are expanding. They trap the sediments and detritus that drops off the leaves and other things that drop off all help build up the shoreline, so that mangroves are actually helping to build the shoreline, and may be able to, in some places, keep up with rising sea levels to some extent. So mangroves are extremely important from that perspective as well. And then related to climate change is the mangrove value for carbon sequestration, for removing carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas that's causing climate change, removing it from the atmosphere, incorporating it into their biomass, and sequestering it so it doesn't get re-released rapidly. Mangroves are a lot more efficient than terrestrial forests at doing this, even than things like rainforests, for two reasons. One is they absorb carbon more efficiently. They absorb it at a greater rate on a per unit area basis. They're absorbing anywhere from 850 or so to about 1,000 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So they have a high rate of carbon sequestration, and they also store that carbon differently than terrestrial forests. In terrestrial forests, a lot of that carbon gets bound up in the living biomass of the tree. So that when that tree gets cut down or burned as firewood or fuel, that carbon gets re-released into the atmosphere. With mangroves, they bury it into their root systems, which buries it underneath all these sediments that they trap, forming this layer of, it's called peat, and it basically keeps it buried there and doesn't re-release it into the atmosphere as quickly. So higher sequestration rates, it absorbs it more, and it stores it more efficiently than terrestrial forests. That's extremely valuable. Just going back to that for a second, on the carbon market at present, there can be upwards of $20 per ton of carbon for a carbon credit or offset. So a hectare of mangrove forest can be valued at anywhere up to like $20,000 just for absorbing carbon. Another way that they can be of economic value to people is through ecotourism. Increasingly, there's kayaking tours in mangroves, particularly in the Bahamas and some of our national parks, Lucayan National Park, occasionally in Bonefish National Park. Even snorkeling in mangroves is gaining in popularity. Birding in mangroves is also another activity that all generates revenues to local communities. So protecting a hectare of mangrove can provide a lot of value, not just to nature, helping nature function normally, but also to the people that live there, in terms of money coming in from tourism, the carbon it sequesters, which not only fights climate change, but also can provide revenues on the carbon market, increasing the number of fish, particularly fishery species, and reducing storm impacts, protecting coastal properties and lives. And in the Bahamas, there's been some valuation of mangrove systems, which can vary anywhere from $550,000 per square kilometer per year, up to 1.2 or $1.25 million per square kilometer per year. The Bahamas has more mangroves than any other country in the Caribbean, with the exception of Cuba, and that's up for some debate, at over 600,000 acres rather of mangrove. So that's a significant amount of ecosystem services value that mangroves are providing to the Bahamas. Now, not all mangroves are created equal. So I just wanted to make sure that we all understand that. Mangroves vary a lot in where they grow, how they grow, the form they grow. They can form small mangrove islands, like in the top left, or mangrove creek systems like the pictures on the center and the right. They can grow in favorable conditions in the Bahamas to be 20, 25 feet tall, maybe even 30 feet tall in some places. A lot of places, though, they're somewhat stunted, and we refer to them as dwarf mangroves, where they only grow naturally about 3 feet tall. So we have a wide range of variability in mangrove growth in the Bahamas, which provides variability in the services they provide, the value they provide for fisheries, habitat, for biodiversity, for carbon sequestration, etc. So the Bahamas, our mangroves kind of look like this aerial image, where it's a complex matrix mosaic of mangroves, where we have some tall mangroves growing where conditions are favorable. On some of the bare limestone areas, they're dwarf mangroves. They cover a vast area. They're all providing some services and function, but it might vary from place to place, from mangrove system to mangrove system. So hopefully I've convinced you that mangroves are important by now. Next is to say, okay, well, if that was the end of the story, that'd be great. But mangroves are threatened by a number of things. So that value, the services they provide, are being threatened. And I've kind of divided this into 3 different types of threats. Threats that kill or remove mangroves, threats that alter the habitat, making it difficult or impossible for mangroves to grow there where they once were, and threats that might leave mangroves in place but affect how they function, affect their ability to provide those ecosystem services. And I'll talk about each of those. And the threat that causes them. And the biggest threat facing mangroves on a regional level, at least, is coastal development. Mangroves are right where the land meets the sea, which is some of the most valuable real estate that we have on any island. And it's in demand, and it's very much threatened by coastal development because of that. In a place like New Providence, where we have information from aerial photographs going back to the 1950s, and this was an analysis that Lindy Knowles did initially, and we, Will Green, Lindy, and myself are working on redoing it some. We see that over 37% of the coastal mangroves of New Providence have been lost since the late 1950s, over the past 60 years or so. And a good example of this in this image from that report card is Malcolm Creek in the southeast corner of New Providence, where back in the 1950s, I think in 1958, it was a fairly untouched mangrove system with just a few roads going there, but really no development or housing in that area. That's the upper left picture. When we compare that to the upper right, the outline is the same, but you can see the satellite image is very different from the old aerial photos. There's been areas dredged, areas filled, housing encroaching on areas or replacing areas, so that there's very little mangroves left in this entire creek system. And because of that, again, the ecosystem services that those mangroves provide are gone. The habitat's been altered, so mangroves won't come back there. It's not like we can just go plant mangroves and they'll restore that creek system. The habitat's been altered. And the function of the ecosystem has been changed. It's not just places, though, like Nassau, where we're seeing these impacts. In the Family Islands, in more remote parts of the Caribbean region, we're also seeing impacts, maybe on a smaller scale, but still equally significant. Places where people, like in the upper left corner here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, where people have cleared land or bulldozed to fill in areas to expand their property into the mangroves, or cleared a view so that they can see the water better from their house, has destroyed the mangroves. In places where communities have encroached on mangroves, we see increased amount of trash being dumped in the mangroves. They're typically viewed as a swamp that has little value, out of sight, out of mind. So old tires, washers, dryers, all kinds of things we've seen in mangrove systems. And then we also have roads and things like that being built along mangrove creeks where the mangroves have been removed, hard infrastructure has been put in place that mangroves can't grow there anymore. And the services those mangroves provided, the habitat they provide, et cetera, is no longer available. So we do see this pretty much everywhere on every island that's had people living on it in the Bahamas or elsewhere in the region. Another aspect of coastal development related to this is where the mangroves may not have been removed, but the way they function has been altered. And one particular way we see this quite a bit is where the mangroves, scientific terms, we call it fragmentation, where they've been split apart. Another way of looking at it is where a creek or a waterway has been blocked off. In the case of this aerial photograph, from the North Shore Gap area of Grand Bahama. This is an old logging road that was built probably in the 1940s or so. They came up to a mangrove creek system that goes from the north shore of the island deep into the interior and couldn't go around it. So they just put in a causeway, filled it in, put a road right across there, totally blocked off one side of the creek from the other. And you can see the difference in this aerial photograph. On the right side is where the creek eventually opens up into the ocean. You can see the water's a lot clearer, a lot bluer. When we do our in-water assessments there, we see a lot of fish, a very healthy, productive nursery area, high diversity for mangrove systems. All on the right side of that image. On the left side, you can see the water's green. That water actually is a totally different salinity than on the right side. On the right side, it's pretty much similar to open ocean. On the left side, however, in this case, it's nearly freshwater, just from rains flooding in there. It doesn't have any access to salt water anymore, except periodically, and I'll talk about that in a second. It didn't have any fish in there, or hardly any fish. You see right up along the road there, that kind of tan colored stuff, that's blue-green algae, cyanobacteria mats that have come up off the bottom and are just floating around there. That water is totally stagnant with low dissolved oxygen, so it can't even really support healthy communities. So this road caused basically 2/3 of that mangrove system to be blocked off and turned from mangrove nursery for fish and providing all those other services into a big puddle, big stagnant puddle that breeds a lot of mosquitoes and doesn't have much else. The other thing is that when Hurricane Dorian came, the storm surge washed over that road and flooded the entire area. So everywhere in this picture was underwater during Hurricane Dorian. But what happened was on the right side of the road where the creeks were, the water was able to recede and go right back out into the ocean. So you still see a lot of green area there in the coppice in the center island. On the left side of the road, though, the water was blocked. It couldn't make it back out to the ocean, so it just sat there for weeks. And that was salt water, and that killed off a lot of the coppice and pineland around there. So just the fact that that road is there prevented the natural flushing, the way the water would recede from a hurricane, and made the damage even worse. And that brings us to another source of threats to mangroves, and that is hurricanes. This is a threat that is a natural threat, although there's strong evidence that hurricanes are being increased in strength and intensity by climate change. We saw this with Hurricane Dorian, where it was the most intense storm in the Atlantic. It also sat around over Abaco and Grand Bahama for a long time, and it killed a lot of mangroves. The way this happened was the flooding, the storm surge came in and just inundated those mangroves. Even though they're tolerant to salt water, they're not tolerant to salt water at the being totally submerged in it and totally submerged for a long period of time. So mangrove shorelines that look like the top picture now look like the one in the bottom picture, just trunks and sticks left. Those sticks still provide some of the ecosystem services that mangroves provide, as fish habitat, things like that. But as the wood rots, which it's rotting rapidly now, that habitat's going away. In addition to that, the way that mangroves sequester carbon requires them to be alive. The way that they build up the shoreline requires them to be alive and constantly contributing nutrients and sediments to build out areas. That starts to erode when the mangroves die like this. If it erodes to the point where there's no longer any emergent land, where there's the water's completely submerged all the time, the land's completely submerged by water all the time, those mangroves might not be able to recover and reestablish themselves there. So right now we're racing against time to restore them, and I'll talk about that in a minute. When we look at the extent of damage from Hurricane Dorian, we mapped this out, and what we did was we looked at what mangroves were like before the storm and then compared it to what they look like after. And we used high resolution satellite imagery that could get to just a couple meters in for each pixel, and could map out where the greatest damage occurred. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but for Grand Bahama, over 14,000 acres of mangroves were destroyed, totally dead. For Abaco, 10,000 acres. In addition to that, for Grand Bahama, there was another 10,000 acres that was severely damaged. And for that was for Grand Bahama. For Abaco, it was about 5,500. So severe impact to tens of thousands of acres of mangroves. And just to show you what the color coding system on the map here, the green areas are where there's healthy mangroves, like this top photo. The red areas are where there were very productive, tall, healthy mangroves that are totally dead afterwards. That's the red. The pink areas are areas where there was the dwarf mangroves beforehand the storm. So less productive, a little sparse, but still healthy. After the storm, those dwarf mangroves totally dead. The areas in orange were areas where there was severe damage, but still there's some mangroves that survived. And then the light green, where there's moderate damage, there was a mix of mangrove death and survival there. So in total, the damage was greater than what we've seen anywhere else, to my knowledge, in the Bahamas at least, if not the whole region, as far as damage to mangroves. The question is, all right, we have all this damage. How do we restore it? What do we do about it? Or is it going to come back on its own and we don't need to worry about it? Well, that's something that we set out to try to figure out. And in looking at these mangrove areas, if we wanted to restore them, we can't restore that much mangroves. We just don't have the resources for that. We don't have the money. We don't have the manpower. So we need to prioritize what areas are most important for us to restore. And we came up with a prioritization system that used each of these bullet points. So the first was using satellites to determine what the damage was. And I just explained that. Next, we use a drone to see if there was areas of natural recovery. And the drone that we have, this commercial drone, is equipped with a high resolution camera. That's on the right in this picture. And then on the left, there's multispectral imaging sensors that are detecting 10 different bands of light, including light beyond what our human eyes can see, in the near infrared spectrum in particular, which is very useful to determine how much photosynthesis is going on in an area, how productive that area is. So that's what we used in the satellite imagery. We can use it at higher resolution in the drone. With the drone, we're talking about a resolution of 1.5 centimeters for the camera and about 8 centimeters for the multispectral imaging sensor. So we're really looking at, we can see individual mangrove leaves, basically, to see if there's new recovery happening. And what we would get would be images like this. The top images are using the camera. The bottom images are an interpretation of the multispectral imaging, where the blue is water. In the bottom images, the green is the dead mangrove, the gray sticks that you see in the top image. And the red is where there's actually photosynthesis occurring, where there's living mangroves, and we can verify that these are mangroves. So even in the top images, if we just look at those, we see there's an awful lot of depth, but it kind of tells a different story when we can see it using these advanced technology to see, okay, in the bottom, about 30% or more of those mangroves are still alive, actually. And that is a pretty good amount that may recover on its own. So the areas in red may turn these areas that are green red over the next few years as they produce seeds and replenish those areas. That's the images on the left. And the ones on the right, yeah, there's some living mangroves there. There's probably 10 or 12 in this whole scene, but that might not be enough to help this recover. So that would be a higher area for prioritization of restoration to help that area recover. So we can use technology to help make those decisions. And this is just what the areas of damage look like, the areas that showed up as green in those multispectral imaging. And this is what some of the other areas look like, where we are starting to see some red recovery, new mangrove seeds settling in there, starting to grow into little seedlings. So that is a way to filter down the number of potential areas to restore. We also want to make sure that we're going to be restoring those areas that are providing the most in terms of ecosystem services, getting the most bang for our buck. So we've done a lot of in-water and on-the-ground surveys to see which areas are important for fisheries, which areas are important for biodiversity, questions like that to see what the ecosystem value is of different mangroves. And we can prioritize from that. And we do have, for Abaco and Grand Bahama, some data from before the storm that we can compare to after and see how things have changed. And then the last level in prioritizing things is not just to look at how nature has changed, but also to see where people want things changed, talking to local communities, talking to the resource users, in this case, a lot of bonefish guides, to see where we want to invest our resources that are going to provide benefits to them as well, and how they use the mangroves. So we can incorporate all four of these things into a way to prioritize these areas, and then really pick the areas that we think are the most important for restoration. When it comes to restoration, we have a bunch of different options, and all of them are based, in the case of Hurricane Dorian, replanting mangroves. The mangroves got killed by the storm. The habitat hasn't been altered yet, though. So we can, by replanting, get the mangroves going again, jumpstart the recovery process. And that, no matter what method you're using, begins with taking mangrove propagules off of trees and planting them in one form or another. And just to show you the amount that we can do, this is an area actually in Abaco that is still healthy after the storm, in North Abaco in this case. In a period of 4 days between Abaco and Grand Bahama, with 6 people working for half a day, volunteering their time, we collected over 20,000 propagules to plant. So there's a plentiful, during the summer especially, source of seeds that we can use for replanting. Where the differences in methods come is what we do with those seeds. So there's partners of ours like Bonefish and Tarpon Trust and Waterkeeper Bahamas that have set up mangrove nurseries where they plant those propagules, the seeds, in little pots. They grow the seedlings for a period of time till they start sprouting, and then plant them out into the areas that they're restoring. This is an effective means of doing it, restoration. But it's maybe not the most suited for all areas. There are some areas that might be difficult to access with this. The other thing is that to do it at scale, you can fit 20,000 mangroves into just a bunch of coolers and buckets and put them in the back of a truck or a boat and take them out there. To get those same number of seedlings out takes a lot more people, more cars or trucks, more boats to get it out there. So just in terms of scalability and low resources, what we're also doing, and this is just an example of mangroves planted using this seedling method. What we've been doing, though, in places where we want to scale things up to greater numbers, or places that might not be the most accessible to carry in all those seedlings, we can just go and plant the propagules directly into the bottom. So where we collect them, we can then take them out the next day, stick them in the mud next to existing mangroves that have died, and they have a very good chance of surviving and growing. And this is just an example with another restoration that we did in Bonefish Pond National Park about 10 years ago, where we planted individual propagules. This is the growth after 10 years, and those are naturally dwarf mangroves, but very healthy, producing seeds, and with a high survival rate. What about in places like this, where even just carrying seeds in is difficult? You can't get in there. It's physically obstructed by all this debris. It's just a danger to try to do it in there. Or there's places where the mud is too deep and you just can't physically get to these places. What can we do then? Well, other people have developed ways that we can use the same kind of drone that we have and take the cameras off, attach a bucket that can be used to do airdrops of mangrove seedlings, not seedlings, propagules, to get them into places where we wouldn't ordinarily get them. Or we can just go to the edge of a creek mouth on an incoming tide and dump a lot of mangroves there, where a good percentage of those are going to get caught up in the root systems of the dead mangroves and be able to seed themselves and start growing. Basically, we're just, in this case, giving nature a helping hand. There's not enough natural mangrove seeds, propagules reaching these areas. So we're just increasing the number of propagules reaching there and letting nature do its thing in this case. What about this case where there's blocked creeks? This is something that we've identified over 120 or so of these creek systems around the Bahamas that are blocked like this. This requires, planting mangroves won't fix this problem. What we can do, though, is do the same types of assessment to prioritize areas, and then go and restore the hydrology, restore the water flow. And in most cases, this is enough to get the mangrove systems working again, even promoting natural regrowth of mangroves just by opening up the system. In small systems, this can be done with a bunch of people with shovels. In bigger systems, it takes heavy equipment like an excavator to do this. And we have a number of examples around the Bahamas where this has been done. On the bottom left there is a place in Grand Bahama called August Creek, where Bonefish Tarpon Trust went in with an excavator and took this causeway and cut 3 channels in it to let water flow from one side to the other, and it's been effective. To the right of that is another place in Grand Bahama where there's just been an old footpath that was removed. On the top left is London Creek and Andros, where a causeway, again, Ministry of Works totally removed it, replaced it with this big fancy bridge. So in the bottom pictures, nobody really cared if there was still access to get across the creek. In places where there's a road, though, putting in a bridge, or in the top right, putting in some culverts to let water flow through may do the trick. So this is something we're also looking to do throughout the Bahamas to restore mangrove systems. And just to quickly finish with some examples of what we have done and where people can participate, just looking at Bonefish Pond in Nassau, New Providence, where we did in 2013 a restoration where there was this dead end channel with stagnant water that wasn't really doing much of anything. We brought in an excavator with the Nature Conservancy and Bahamas National Trust and opened up both ends of this area so that water would flow through it naturally. We then followed that up with mangrove planting, and we did both seedlings and propagules. The picture on the left is seedlings you can see sticking out of the water right after we did the restoration in 2013. And the picture on the right is that same area, slightly different angle, but same area in December of 2022. So those mangroves really have taken on, and this is now looking like a natural creek system there. And just to show you in places where we planted both seedlings and propagules, we couldn't tell the difference between them after about a year or less. And this is what they look like now. regardless of what method we use for planting them. So we can restore mangroves. The question a lot of people ask me, though, is, what can I do as an individual? And there's a number of answers to that. The first is to get involved. You don't need an advanced PhD in mangroveology to restore mangroves. We are working with a lot of volunteer groups, students, to collect the mangrove propagules, to start them planted in nurseries, etc., and to then outplant those into areas to restore. And just to show that anybody can do it, this is the team that did the Bonefish Pond restoration. You can see there's people aged there from 5 to 50, male, female. It worked very well, and anybody can do it. Other things that people can do for mangroves is just to protect and respect them. Mangroves are a protected species in the Bahamas, so they need a permit to be removed. But we do know that, there's still a lot of removal that goes on. There's a lot of dumping and things like that. So not dumping trash in mangroves, or in places where trash is accumulated or washed into mangroves, removing the trash. This can help remove blockages. It can help increase water quality, improve the habitat for fish and other things, and promote mangrove growth. Mangroves are not going to grow where they're buried in trash. And then in places where mangroves are being infringed upon, trying to talk to landowners about the importance of mangroves so that they know not to remove those mangroves. So I'll end it there. Just want to thank all of you for listening. Thank our partners and funders that supported a lot of this research over the past few years, which are shown there, and let you know how to get in touch with us. If you know of any mangroves that need restored, if you're interested in more information, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And I'll end it there and take any questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Dalhgren, for the extremely insightful look into why mangroves matter, as well as their importance and the restoration of them here in the Bahamas. As you said, we are in the Q&A session, so if any participant would like to ask the presenter a question, please raise your hand. And you can also post your question in the chat, and I can read it out loud to him for him to answer it.
Hey, Danielle, we do have one question asking about main point of contact for schools to assist with mangrove cultivation and replanting projects. So anyone who's interested in getting involved with that, either from a school perspective or as an individual, you can email us at ccea@perryinstitute.org, and we'll also drop that email in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. All righty, so if we do not have any questions or raised hands, by the way, the same email that was mentioned, it was posted in the chat, as well as a few other useful links, such as the link to the hurricane damage ArcGIS online map, as well as the Mangrove Report Card. Those can also be found in the chat. But seeing as though we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you so much, our participants, for joining us today, as well as another huge thank you to Dr. Dalhgren. For more information, please visit our website at perryinstitute.org. And like and follow us on social media. including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And also, please join us in May for our next webinar focused on our work supporting blue economies. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.